Hey guys, tonight we are travelling back to the 12th century to live a single day inside the cracked, swollen, slowly disintegrating body of King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. A teenage ruler whose daily schedule included leprosy, religious warfare, palace politics, sunstroke, betrayal, espionage, and the constant suspicion that absolutely everyone around him was either lying, plotting, or both at the same time. So before you settle in, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these long, quiet historical journeys. And please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, because it is always strangely comforting to imagine all of us scattered across the planet, drifting quietly into the same story together. Now dim the lights, find a soft blanket, maybe rest your head against something gentle, and let us slip back into a world of incense, stone corridors, dust, oil lamps, and a kingdom that, frankly, should never have survived as long as it did. You were born in the year 1161 inside the royal palace of Jerusalem, which is already a bold choice if your long-term life goals include things like sleeping peacefully, having a functioning immune system, or living past the age of 30. The Kingdom of Jerusalem at this point is technically a Christian state, but in practice it is a heavily armed nervous breakdown carved into desert rock and propped up by a few thousand exhausted European knights who arrived expecting heavenly transcendence and discovered, instead, sand, fleas, scorpions, and tax disputes. Your father is King Amalric I, a man whose entire reign can be summarized as trying to prevent a kingdom held together with prayer and stubbornness from quietly disintegrating into civil war. He spends most of his life campaigning in Egypt, negotiating with Byzantine emperors, paying off mercenaries, marrying strategically, divorcing strategically, remarrying strategically, and trying to convince his nobles that perhaps, just perhaps, fighting each other while surrounded by hostile neighbours is not the optimal long-term strategy. The nobles, as a rule, disagree. Medieval nobles always disagree. It is their natural state, like cats hissing at vacuum cleaners. Your mother is Agnes of Courtenay, a woman whose marriage to your father has already been annulled by the time you're old enough to understand what a marriage even is, primarily because the patriarchs of the church decided that her bloodline was politically inconvenient. This is medieval politics in a single sentence. People are not divorced for incompatibility. They are divorced for inconvenient grandparents. As a young boy, you grow up surrounded by the strange, hot, exhausted atmosphere of Crusader Jerusalem. The streets smell of dust, animals, baking bread, incense, and the slow, steady tang of a city that has never quite learned the concept of sanitation. Knights in chainmail clatter through the courtyards. Priests glide silently through cloisters whispering in Latin. Servants run errands constantly because in the medieval world there are no convenient solutions to anything, and every single task requires a human being and a bucket. Your tutor is William of Tyre, a scholar, churchman, and historian who will eventually write the most important chronicle of your reign. William is patient, intelligent, deeply religious, and possesses one of the only well-organized brains in the entire kingdom. He teaches you Latin, French scripture, history, rhetoric, and the basics of statecraft. And to everyone's surprise, you are extraordinarily bright. You learn quickly. You read voraciously. You ask thoughtful, surprisingly mature questions about war, peace, justice, and faith. While other noble boys are throwing rocks at lizards and dueling each other with wooden sticks until somebody starts crying, you are quietly memorizing the genealogies of the Plantagenets and analysing the failures of past Crusader strategy. William writes glowingly about you in his chronicle. He calls you handsome, dignified, intelligent beyond your years, and possessed of a calmness and gravity that adults around the court find faintly unsettling. Imagine being 8 years old and inspiring grown knights to murmur things like, "That child has the bearing of a king." It is flattering. It is also a faintly ominous omen, because in medieval Jerusalem the universe rarely allows good things to remain unspoiled for very long, and then comes the day that changes absolutely everything. You are playing with the other boys of the court, the sons of nobles and knights who form your informal companions and future advisors. The game, like most medieval children's games, is essentially a low-grade physical torture contest involving pinching, slapping, wrestling, and seeing who can endure pain longest without crying. The other boys yelp. They wince, they flinch, they pull back their arms in protest. You do not. At first they assume you are being brave. They pinch harder. Still nothing. They twist your skin. Still nothing. The boys begin to look at one another uneasily. The atmosphere shifts in the way medieval atmospheres always shift, with priests appearing silently from doorways and adults beginning to whisper in Latin, like the opening credits of a horror film. William of Tyre notices first. He watches you for a long moment. He tests your arm gently. He presses, scratches, pinches. Nothing. Your right arm has lost all sensation. Physicians are summoned, which in 12th century Jerusalem is approximately equivalent to announcing, "We have invited a small group of well-meaning men carrying unwashed knives, herbs of questionable provenance, and theological theories about humours to inspect a child." The doctors examine you. They consult ancient texts. They argue in increasingly tense voices. They discuss your symptoms using a careful blend of medicine, astrology, and panic. Eventually a conclusion arrives, slow and merciless, like an executioner adjusting his sleeves. Leprosy. Now today, leprosy is a treatable bacterial infection. In the 12th century, however, it is one of the most feared and theologically loaded diseases in the entire medieval world. People view it as a divine punishment, a mark of impurity, a sign that the soul itself is rotting in advance of the body. Lepers are forced to wear bells. They are forced to live outside city walls. They are forced into special colonies where they will slowly disintegrate, attended only by other lepers, while the rest of the world quietly pretends they no longer exist. And here you are, a small boy of perhaps 8 or 9, future king of Jerusalem, son of a reigning monarch, intelligent and beloved by your tutor, condemned to one of the most stigmatized illnesses the medieval mind can imagine. The room around you continues to function. Servants move quietly. Priests bless you with trembling hands. William of Tyre stares at the floor and tries not to cry. Outside, the bells of Jerusalem ring. The sun shines. Camels grumble in the marketplace. The world has not noticed the catastrophe that has just unfolded in a stone chamber inside the royal palace. But every adult in the room understands. The future king is dying, and the future king does not yet know it. For the next few years, the disease moves slowly. Leprosy is not the dramatic, instantly visible illness modern imagination tends to assume. It progresses across decades, attacking nerves first, then skin, then cartilage, then muscle, then bone. In its early stages, it may even be hidden beneath sleeves and gloves. Your right arm gradually loses strength. Patches of numbness creep along your fingers. You sometimes injure yourself on furniture and only realise it hours later when servants point at the dried blood. This, by the way, is one of leprosy's particular cruelties. Patients do not feel pain. They burn themselves. They cut themselves. They develop infections from injuries they never even noticed. The disease does not kill quickly. It removes the body's warning system and lets the world do the killing slowly. You learn to be careful. You learn to glance at your hands more often than other children do. You learn to disguise the loss of grip strength when handling cups and reins. You learn how to wrap fabric strategically around fingers. You learn the small, humiliating choreography of a body slipping away one piece at a time, and meanwhile the world keeps demanding that you train for kingship. So you train. You learn riding, which becomes increasingly difficult as your right hand loses precision on the reins. You learn swordsmanship, which becomes increasingly hazardous as your grip weakens and your nerves dull. You learn protocol, which involves standing for hours in heavy ceremonial garments under the Jerusalem sun, while priests perform rituals that test the endurance of healthy adults, let alone children with progressive nerve damage. You bear it all, without complaint. William of Tyre writes that you carry yourself with extraordinary composure. The court watches you closely. Some nobles whisper that perhaps the disease will spare you. Perhaps God will intervene. Perhaps your strength of character will somehow drag your body back from the precipice. Medieval people are deeply optimistic about the power of prayer to override biology, which is sweet, in the way that medieval optimism is generally sweet, right up until the moment reality politely disagrees. Then, in 1174, your father dies. He returns from a military campaign in the north, contracts dysentery, weakens, declines, lingers, and finally fades. He's in his late 30s. Medieval kingship is brutal even on healthy men. Amalric simply runs out of road. And just like that, at the age of 13, you become King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem. The coronation is magnificent. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre overflows with priests, banners, incense, candles, and the deep low chanting that medieval ceremonies used to create the impression that something cosmically important is happening. The Patriarch of Jerusalem places a crown upon your head while the assembled nobility kneels. To the watching crowds in the streets, you appear as a slim, pale, dignified young king, the divine choice of God, a hopeful symbol of a kingdom that desperately, urgently, painfully needs hope. Inside the royal robes, however, your body is quietly disintegrating. The contrast is almost theatrical. The crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem upon the head of a teenager whose nervous system is slowly being eaten by a bacterial infection. The medieval world loves symbols, and rarely has it produced one more poetically tragic than this. In the first weeks of your reign, the court attempts to convince itself that the situation is manageable. Perhaps the disease will plateau. Perhaps a regency can buy time. Perhaps you will marry, produce an heir, and the bloodline will survive even if you do not. Everyone smiles politely. Everyone speaks softly. Everyone behaves as though the boy on the throne is not visibly losing function in his right arm. The court of medieval Jerusalem operates on a foundation of cheerful denial, which honestly is a survival mechanism that anyone living under the constant threat of invasion has every right to develop. A regent is appointed because the kingdom cannot afford to wait for you to grow into the throne. The first regent is Miles of Plancy, a Frankish noble of, let us say, modest popularity, primarily because he is foreign, arrogant, and considered by the local barons to be an irritating outsider. His reign lasts a matter of months before he is assassinated in the streets of Acre by unknown attackers, which is medieval shorthand for everyone politically inconvenienced by him quietly agreed that he should die, and no one bothered investigating very hard afterwards. Welcome to medieval politics. The official cause of death is usually listed as multiple stab wounds, but the deeper cause is almost always a coalition meeting that nobody admitted attending. Following Miles, the regency passes to Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, a much more competent man, a distant relative of the royal family, deeply experienced in the politics of the East, fluent in Arabic, intellectually formidable, and generally regarded as the most stable mind in a kingdom suffering from a chronic shortage of stable minds. Raymond stabilizes your administration. He keeps the nobles from murdering each other publicly. He maintains diplomatic ties with the surrounding Muslim powers. He delays the slow-grinding catastrophe that everyone secretly fears. For a brief moment the kingdom breathes. Then the future arrives, and the future, as it turns out, has a name: Saladin, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Kurdish by origin, Sunni Muslim by faith, deeply intelligent, calm under pressure, militarily gifted, politically patient, religiously sincere, and possessed of one of the most dangerous traits any opponent can have, which is the capacity to wait. Saladin is not a wild raider thundering out of the desert. He is a strategist. He is methodical. He builds alliances. He consolidates Egypt. He absorbs Syria. He waits for cracks in the Crusader states and quietly widens them. He is, frankly, the worst possible adversary a sick teenage king could inherit, because Saladin's chosen weapon is time. And time is the one resource you do not have. From the moment you take the throne, you understand that your reign will be defined by him. Every council meeting, every campaign, every alliance, every marriage negotiation, every tax collection ultimately reduces to one question. What will Saladin do, and can we survive it? Saladin himself, by all accounts, is curious about you. He hears stories of the young Leper King from his spies and ambassadors. He's told that you are intelligent, dignified, courageous, and physically broken. He treats you, throughout your reign, with a strange mixture of military aggression and personal respect, which is a combination that 12th century enemies almost never bothered to maintain toward each other. Most medieval opponents were perfectly happy to insult one another in elaborate religious language, while simultaneously trying to kill each other's children. Saladin, in your case, fights you brutally, but speaks of you with measured respect. Even your enemies recognize something extraordinary in you. Meanwhile, your daily life as king becomes a study in quiet endurance. You wake before dawn, because the heat of Jerusalem makes early morning the only tolerable working hours of the day. Servants help you dress, increasingly so as your hands lose function. Your right arm now hangs weakly. Your left hand begins showing early symptoms. Your face, mercifully, is still untouched. You can still appear publicly without a mask. The court breathes a little easier each morning that your features remain recognizable. You attend mass. You hear petitions. You meet ambassadors. You sit through council meetings during which nobles argue passionately about land disputes, tax assessments, marriage alliances, and inheritance squabbles, while the actual existential threat of Muslim armies massing across your borders is treated almost as a background concern. This is one of the great recurring tragedies of Crusader politics. The nobles of Jerusalem behave throughout the entire 12th century as though the kingdom has infinite time, infinite manpower, and infinite divine favour, when in reality it possesses none of these. They argue about who married whose cousin, while Saladin builds armies the size of small nations. They feud over castles while entire counties burn. They believe their internal status games matter, when in fact the only thing that matters is the question of whether Jerusalem itself will exist in 20 years. Spoiler, it will not. But for now, you sit through their arguments, you weigh their petitions, you sign documents with your left hand, occasionally you raise your voice calmly and carefully, and the room goes silent, because even sick, even teenage, even visibly fragile, you possess an authority the rest of them do not. They are nobles. You are the king, and medieval kingship, when properly performed, carries weight that no amount of noble bluster can match. The hours stretch, the sun rises, the palace heats, flies gather. The smell of cooking drifts from distant kitchens. Pages run errands, priests pray, knights drill in the courtyards. A leper king sits upon a throne carved from stone older than his entire bloodline, and presides over a kingdom whose long-term survival depends on his ability to outlast a body that is already beginning to give up on him. It is not the future anyone imagined when you were born, but it is the future you have, and remarkably, against every conceivable expectation, you are doing it well. The first true test of your reign arrives sooner than anyone expects, because medieval kingdoms rarely grant their rulers a polite settling-in period. By the time you're 15, Saladin has consolidated his power in Egypt and begun probing the borders of the Crusader states with raids, feints, and slow strategic pressure. He has not yet declared full war. He does not need to. He is simply demonstrating that he can. And the nobles of Jerusalem, with their usual instinct for productive cooperation, respond by arguing about whose responsibility border defence actually is. The court splits, as it always does, into factions. There is the so-called native baronage, the nobles who were born in the Holy Land, who speak Arabic, who maintain trade relationships with Muslim neighbours, who understand the region's politics intimately, and who tend to favour caution, diplomacy, and pragmatic coexistence. Their leader is Raymond of Tripoli, your former regent, a man whose intellect has been forged by decades of navigating the impossible politics of the East. Then there is the newcomer faction, the courtiers and adventurers who have recently arrived from Europe, drawn by religious zeal and dreams of personal glory, who do not speak Arabic, who do not understand the local geopolitics, and who view every Muslim leader as either a heretic to be smashed or an opportunity to be exploited. Their leadership shifts depending on which European knight has most recently arrived, but at its core it is dominated by your mother, Agnes of Courtenay, who has re-entered court life with a vengeance, and her allies. The two factions despise each other. They disagree on everything: foreign policy, marriage alliances, military strategy, tax policy, whose niece should marry whose nephew, whose castle should be reinforced first, whose chaplain should perform the next major ceremony. The arguments are constant, exhausting, petty, and absolutely catastrophic for a kingdom that needs unity above all else. You, sitting between them on your stone throne, with a body that increasingly does not respond to your commands, must somehow hold this fracturing coalition together. And remarkably, for a long time, you do. You play the factions against each other when necessary. You side with the native baronage on matters of diplomacy because they actually understand the region. You side with the newcomers on matters of military boldness because the kingdom occasionally needs aggression. You manage your mother's ambitions carefully, granting her influence in some areas while restraining her in others. You demonstrate, in short, a political instinct that men 3 times your age struggle to match. William of Tyre marvels at this in his chronicle. He describes you as wise, just, and possessed of a clarity of judgment entirely unsuited to your years. But underneath the carefully managed politics, the deeper problem remains. You are sick. Every month your body weakens further. Every month the kingdom edges closer to the inevitable crisis of succession. Every month Saladin grows stronger. and every month your nobles waste precious time arguing about matters that, in the longer arc of history, will not matter at all. By the year 1177, when you are 16 years old, Saladin decides that the waiting period is over. He gathers an enormous army in Egypt and prepares an invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The size of the force is, by medieval standards, staggering. Estimates vary, as they always do for medieval armies, but contemporary chroniclers describe a host of tens of thousands, supported by camels, cavalry, archers, siege engineers, and the kind of logistical apparatus that suggests Saladin is not merely raiding. He intends to break the Crusader states permanently. He intends to take Jerusalem. He intends to end the entire Christian presence in the Holy Land in a single decisive campaign. The Crusader response is, predictably, disorganized. Knights are scattered across various castles, mercenaries are unpaid, nobles are squabbling, reinforcements have not arrived from Europe, the Templars and Hospitallers are bickering over jurisdiction. The kingdom, in short, is exactly as unprepared as a kingdom can be when surprised by a competent enemy. And you, the 16-year-old Leper King, are in the worst position imaginable, because you cannot afford to flee, you cannot afford to wait, and you cannot afford to lose. You ride out. Despite your illness, despite the protests of your advisors, despite the obvious physical risk, you put on your armour, you mount your horse, and you ride at the head of a hastily assembled army of perhaps a few hundred knights and several thousand foot soldiers. Saladin's army outnumbers yours by something in the range of 10 to 1, possibly worse. The Crusader force is, by any reasonable analysis, doomed, and yet you ride. The march is gruelling. The Jerusalem sun beats down on heavy armour. Water is scarce. Dust coats every visible surface. Your right arm, the one that no longer feels pain, is strapped firmly to your body so it does not flop uselessly. You hold the reins with your left. You speak quietly to your knights, calming nerves, giving orders, performing the slow, careful theatre of medieval kingship, even as your skin sweats inside metal in the desert heat. You meet the forward elements of Saladin's army near a place called Montgzard, a low rise of hills not far from the coast. Saladin, by this point, has divided his enormous host. Some of his forces are conducting raids further inland. He believes the Crusaders are bottled up in Ascalon and cannot risk a major engagement. He is briefly careless, and carelessness, in medieval warfare, is the only opening an outnumbered force ever truly receives. You attack. The charge of the Frankish heavy cavalry, when properly executed, is one of the most devastating military instruments of the medieval world. It is essentially a battering ram of armoured men and horses moving at high speed across open ground. It cannot be sustained. It cannot be repeated indefinitely. It can be defeated by disciplined infantry or terrain. But when it lands, particularly against a surprised enemy on open ground, it shatters formations almost instantly. At Montgzard, it lands perfectly. The Crusader knights, with you riding among them, smash into Saladin's forces before they can fully assemble. Confusion turns to panic. Panic turns to rout. Saladin's army, the same army that was meant to end the kingdom of Jerusalem forever, breaks and flees across the plains. Thousands are killed. Thousands more are scattered into the desert. Saladin himself escapes only barely, riding a camel through the chaos with a small handful of bodyguards. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most unlikely military victories of the entire Crusader period. A 16-year-old king with leprosy, leading a vastly outnumbered force, has just shattered the army of the most formidable Muslim commander of the age. The news travels across the medieval world. In Europe it is celebrated as a divine miracle. Sermons are preached about the holy boy king who triumphed through faith. Songs are written. Poets compose verses. The image of Baldwin IV, the Leper King charging at the head of his knights against impossible odds, becomes one of the most powerful symbols of Crusader resistance for generations afterward. And yet, when you return to Jerusalem exhausted, sunburnt, your skin chafed raw beneath your armour, what waits for you is not a victory parade. It is more political squabbling, because the nobles of Jerusalem, true to form, have spent the entire campaign arguing about what to do next. They congratulate you politely. They celebrate Montgisard publicly. And then they immediately resume disputing tax assessments, marriage alliances, and whose chaplain is more theologically reliable. The kingdom you have just saved has not changed at all. It has merely been granted a temporary reprieve, and you, the boy who delivered that reprieve, must somehow remain standing long enough to deliver another one. The years immediately following Montgisard are, in some ways, the strangest of your entire reign, because they are years of partial peace, fragile diplomacy, and constant low-intensity skirmishing along the borders. Saladin, having absorbed the lesson of Montgisard, becomes more cautious. He no longer attempts to break the kingdom in a single dramatic invasion. Instead, he begins the slow strategic work of nibbling at your edges, capturing minor castles, raiding farms, intercepting caravans, exhausting your treasury, and waiting for an opportunity that better suits his patience. You, meanwhile, attempt to take advantage of his temporary withdrawal by reinforcing the kingdom's defences. You order new fortifications, you repair existing ones. You authorise an ambitious construction project at a place called Jacob's Ford, also known by its Arabic name Vadum Yaqub, a strategic crossing point on the upper Jordan River that has long been a sore point in the relationship between the kingdom and the Muslim lords of Damascus. Constructing a major castle there is, by any reasonable analysis, a provocative act, because the location grants whoever holds it enormous influence over caravan routes and military movements in the region. The Templars are placed in charge of the project. The works begin. Saladin protests, then offers bribes for the project to be abandoned, then escalates his protests further when the bribes are refused, then begins assembling forces. The project becomes a kind of slow-motion diplomatic catastrophe, in which everyone involved understands that war is approaching, but nobody is willing to back down. Before Jacob's Ford comes to its inevitable conclusion, however, an earlier engagement intervenes. In the summer of 1179, you ride north with your forces to support raids in the area around Banias, a region of contested borderland near the slopes of Mount Hermon. The expedition is conducted partly out of strategic necessity, partly out of the relentless need to project military presence so that the local Muslim populations remember whose king is collecting their taxes this season. Things go reasonably well at first. Then, as your army maneuvers through difficult terrain, it is ambushed by forces under Saladin's nephew, a young commander named Farrukh Shah, near a place the Crusaders call Marj Ayun. The Crusader force is caught off guard. Discipline collapses. The constable of the kingdom, Humphrey II of Turon, an experienced and respected commander, is mortally wounded attempting to cover the retreat. The master of the Templars is captured. Several other prominent nobles are taken prisoner. The army disintegrates, and you yourself are nearly captured, saved only by the desperate intervention of attendants who lift you bodily from your horse and carry you to safety when your weakened limbs can no longer keep you mounted. It is a humiliating reversal. You return to Jerusalem battered, exhausted, and acutely conscious that the brilliant victory of Montgisard was, perhaps, more a matter of circumstance than a permanent shift in the strategic balance. Saladin has learned. You have not yet found the next answer. The kingdom mourns the dead. Ransoms are negotiated for the captured. The construction at Jacob's Ford continues anyway, defiantly, because backing down at this point would be politically impossible. And then, as anyone with any geopolitical sense could have predicted, Saladin arrives in person to finish the project before it can be completed. He brings sappers, archers, siege engineers, and the kind of disciplined methodical force that the Crusaders, after Marj Ayun, can no longer prevent from doing whatever it wishes. The siege of Jacob's Ford in late August 1179 lasts only 6 days. The fortress, only partially completed, cannot withstand a determined assault. The Templar garrison is overwhelmed, the walls breached, the garrison massacred or enslaved. Saladin orders the entire structure dismantled stone by stone, partly to deny the Crusaders any chance of reoccupying it, partly to send a deliberate message about the consequences of attempting to fortify positions he considers strategically threatening. You receive the news in Jerusalem with the kind of weary anger that has by now become a familiar emotional state for you. Another defeat, another commander dead, another castle lost, another reminder that even when you win, you cannot win permanently, and even when Saladin retreats, he comes back. A truce is eventually negotiated in 1180. It is fragile, conditional, and clearly understood by both sides to be temporary, but it grants you a brief reprieve, a period during which the kingdom can rest, regroup, and pretend, for a few months at least, that the existential threat to its existence has been postponed. You use the time to address the question of the succession, which is how Sibylla's marriage to Guy of Lusignan ends up being arranged in such a politically catastrophic manner. You use the time to repair relations with the native baronage. You use the time to manage Reynaud of Chatillon, who has by this point settled into his fortress at Kerak in the Transjordan, and begun behaving with even more egregious recklessness than usual. Reynaud in particular becomes during these years the kind of strategic liability that diplomatic historians of the medieval period have struggled to fully describe without resorting to extremely undignified language. He attacks Muslim merchant caravans in clear violation of the truce. He seizes pilgrims travelling between Damascus and Mecca. He extorts ransoms from prisoners taken under the most flimsy of legal pretexts. And then, in 1182, he conceives and executes a plan so audacious that even by his own previous standards it constitutes a fresh new low. He builds ships, or more precisely, he commissions the construction of small naval vessels at his fortress on the Red Sea coast, transports them in pieces across the desert, reassembles them at the port, and launches them into the Red Sea with the apparent intention of conducting raids along the Arabian coast. The targets of these raids include Muslim shipping, coastal towns, and, according to several contemporary Muslim chroniclers, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina themselves. Now, to be fair to Reynold, the historical record is not entirely clear about whether he actually intended to attack the holy cities, or whether he was simply raiding nearby ports, and was credited by horrified Muslim chroniclers with intentions more ambitious than his actual plans warranted. But the perception was real, and the perception was what mattered. To the Muslim world, the Leper King's kingdom had just sponsored an expedition that came alarmingly close to attacking the most sacred sites in Islam. Saladin's response is one of cold, methodical fury. He dispatches his brother Al-Adil, who hunts down the raiders, captures most of them, and has them executed publicly, in some cases in Mecca itself, to demonstrate the totality of the Muslim response. Reynold himself escapes the consequences because he never accompanied the expedition personally, which is a perfect summary of Reynold's career, the man who provokes catastrophes from a safe distance while other men die for his decisions. Saladin, by all reliable accounts, adds Reynold to a personal list of men whose deaths he intends to oversee directly when the opportunity finally arises. The opportunity will arise. It will simply take a few more years. You, sitting in your palace, hearing the reports of the Red Sea expedition and its aftermath, attempt to discipline Reynold. You issue formal rebukes. You demand he appear at court to answer for his actions. You threaten the confiscation of his lordship. Reynold either ignores the summons or arrives with elaborate excuses and a small army of supporters who make clear that any attempt to actually punish him will require a civil war. The kingdom cannot afford a civil war, so you accept his presence, glare at him in council, and continue managing the consequences of his actions while privately calculating how much damage he can be permitted to do before the structural integrity of your foreign policy collapses entirely. The answer turns out to be a great deal. The other significant institutional headache of your reign is the relationship between the two great military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. Both orders are, in theory, dedicated to the defence of the Holy Land. Both have accumulated enormous wealth, vast networks of estates across Europe and the East, and formidable military capabilities. Both answer directly to the Pope rather than to the King of Jerusalem, which means that managing them is more like conducting diplomacy with two foreign powers operating inside your own kingdom than commanding actual subordinates. And, as the structural logic of medieval institutions almost guarantees, the two orders despise each other. Their feuds are constant. They argue over jurisdictions. They dispute land grants. They quarrel about which order should garrison which castle. They compete for donations from European pilgrims. They produce a steady stream of formal complaints about each other that must be adjudicated by the king, the patriarch, or both. The Templars, by your reign, are led by Odo de Saint-Amand, a man whose temperament can charitably be described as zealously combative. He is captured at Marj Ayoun, refuses to be ransomed because he believes ransoming captured Templars is undignified, and dies in Muslim captivity. He is replaced by Arnold of Toroja, a more diplomatically inclined figure who briefly stabilizes relations until he too dies, after which the Templars elect Gerard of Riefort, who is, by the consensus of nearly every contemporary observer, the worst Templar Grand Master of the entire medieval period, a man whose personal feuds and tactical recklessness will, after your death, contribute directly to the catastrophe at Hattin. The Hospitallers are slightly better led during your reign, but no less politically complicated. They tend to align with the native baronage and Raymond of Tripoli. The Templars increasingly align with the newcomer faction and your mother's allies. The two orders, in effect, become institutional extensions of the court's political divisions, which means that even military disputes about castle defences and frontier garrisons take on factional colouring. You spend, by some estimates, as much of your reign managing the orders as managing the actual war against Saladin. Beyond the great orders, your court contains a constellation of regional lords whose individual personalities matter enormously to the politics of the kingdom. There is Raymond of Tripoli, your former regent, whose intelligence and Arabic fluency make him the closest thing the kingdom has to a competent statesman, but whose Tripolitan power base also gives him interests not always identical to those of Jerusalem. There is Balian of Ibelin, a knight of the local baronage, married to your stepmother Maria Comnena, who will become one of the great figures of the kingdom's final defence and the man who will later negotiate the surrender of Jerusalem itself to Saladin. There is Reginald of Sidon, learned, fluent in Arabic, capable of speaking on equal terms with Muslim emirs, and one of the more thoughtful members of your council. There is Bohemond III of Antioch, ruler of the Northern Crusader Principality, your formal vassal in name but in practice a semi-independent prince whose cooperation must constantly be courted. There is Raymond, Prince of Antioch's son-in-law, whose marriages and remarriages drive several of the strangest political crises of your reign. There is Humphrey IV of Toron, grandson of the constable killed at Marjayoun, eventually married to your half-sister Isabella in a politically charged ceremony that will produce some of the most awkward family dynamics in subsequent succession disputes. The web of relationships is, frankly, exhausting to enumerate, and it is exhausting precisely because medieval politics was exhausting to live through, particularly for someone managing it from a body that grew weaker every month. And throughout it all, Saladin keeps watching. He is, in many ways, the most important figure in your reign other than yourself, and his presence shapes nearly every decision you make. He is roughly 20 years older than you. He came to power in Egypt by gradually displacing the Fatimid dynasty he was nominally serving, then expanded into Syria, then unified most of the surrounding Muslim territories through a combination of military skill, diplomatic patience, and thus careful cultivation of religious legitimacy. He is, by Muslim standards, the most successful unifier of the region since Nur ad-Din. He is, by Christian standards, the most dangerous opponent the Crusader states have faced in their entire existence, and he is in many subtle ways an opponent unlike any other. Most medieval enemies, on both Christian and Muslim sides, conduct warfare with a level of personal viciousness that modern readers find startling. Captives are massacred, prisoners are tortured, truces are broken casually, religious propaganda is deployed at maximum volume. Saladin, while not at all a pacifist, conducts himself with a more measured cruelty. He keeps his word more often than most contemporaries. He treats high-status captives with the degree of dignity. He maintains diplomatic correspondence with Christian rulers in courteous, sometimes even affectionate language. He demonstrates, in countless small ways, a moral discipline that earns him the respect even of his Christian enemies, including yourself. The correspondence between your court and Saladin's during the truce of 1180 to 1182 is preserved partially in later chronicles, and what survives reveals a strange, careful, almost wistful tone. Saladin addresses you with formal honorifics. You respond in kind. He references your illness obliquely, with what seems like genuine sympathy. You reference his strategic patience with what seems like genuine respect. The two of you, separated by religion, by language, by the entire architecture of medieval geopolitical hostility, somehow manage to maintain a relationship of dignified mutual acknowledgement that survives even the inevitable resumption of warfare. None of this prevents him from trying to destroy your kingdom. None of this prevents you from trying to defend it. The strange respect is, perhaps, the only luxury two enemies of your stature can afford each other when the underlying conflict is non-negotiable. In 1182, the truce begins to fray, partly because of Reynald's provocations, partly because Saladin has finished consolidating his position in Syria and is ready for the next phase of the long campaign. Raids resume. Skirmishes intensify. By the spring of 1183, the kingdom is again on full war footing, and Saladin begins assembling forces for a major invasion. The reality of leprosy in the years following Montjessard settles in more aggressively. The disease has been moving slowly through your nervous system for the better part of a decade, but now it begins to accelerate. Your right hand, long since useless, has begun to deform. Skin lesions appear on your forearms. Patches of numbness spread to your legs. Your face, which has so far been mercifully spared, begins to show the first faint signs of swelling around the brow and cheekbones. This is the change everyone has been dreading, because once leprosy reaches the face, the king's public appearance becomes a political problem. You can no longer ride barefaced through the streets. You can no longer appear in court without arranging the lighting carefully. You cannot, without strategic preparation, allow ambassadors to study your features at close range. Servants begin developing skills they did not previously possess. They learn how to apply medicated ointments. They learn how to drape fabric in ways that obscure swelling. They learn how to position you in chairs so that the light from windows falls gently rather than harshly. The court itself becomes an apparatus designed around the slow disguising of your decline. Veils appear in your wardrobe. Long-sleeved tunics replace shorter ceremonial garments. Gloves become standard rather than occasional. The physical choreography of medieval kingship, which is already elaborate, becomes for you a constant low-grade theatre of concealment. And underneath it all, you continue to function. You sit through council meetings. You receive ambassadors. You sign documents, now exclusively with your left hand, though the left hand too is beginning to weaken. You ride, though increasingly with attendants on either side to catch you if you slip. You make decisions. You arbitrate disputes. You command your knights. You manage your mother's intrigues, your sister's marriage negotiations, your noble factions' constant feuding. You age in the way that only sick teenagers can age, faster than the calendar would suggest. By the age of 17, you are described by some chroniclers as looking like a man of 30. By 18, you look 40. By 20, you no longer match any description of a person of your chronological age. Time, which should have been on your side, has betrayed you in the most personal way imaginable, and meanwhile the kingdom's strategic position continues to deteriorate. Saladin, recovering from Montchezard with extraordinary speed, rebuilds his forces and resumes his careful encirclement of the Crusader states. Raids resume, castles change hands, the borders shift unfavourably. Diplomatic correspondence between Jerusalem and Damascus continues, polite and bilingual, full of formal compliments and quiet threats. Saladin understands that he does not need to defeat you in a single battle. He needs only to outlive you, and outliving you, given your physical condition, is the easiest military objective in the entire region. You know this. He knows this. Everyone knows this. The grim arithmetic of your reign cannot be denied. The most pressing political problem becomes the succession, because you will not produce an heir. Leprosy in your stage of progression precludes marriage and reproduction, both biologically and theologically. The Church refuses to permit any union that would expose a queen to your disease, and frankly even the most ambitious princess in Europe would think twice about accepting a husband whose body is visibly disintegrating, which means the kingdom must look to your siblings. Your full sister Sibylla becomes the focus of intense political attention. She is older than you. She is healthy. She is considered attractive by the standards of the period. She is crucially the next available royal womb, which is medieval shorthand for the most important person in the realm, whose opinions absolutely nobody intends to consult. The political marriage negotiations around Sibylla consume enormous quantities of court time. Various European princes are considered. Various local nobles propose themselves. Various factions attempt to maneuver their preferred candidates into position. Your mother Agnes is deeply involved. Raymond of Tripoli is deeply involved. The Templars are involved. The Hospitallers are involved. The Patriarch of Jerusalem is involved. Half the noblemen in the kingdom write letters to half the noblemen in Europe attempting to influence the outcome. Eventually a husband is found for Sibylla, a young European nobleman named William of Montferrat, who arrives in the Holy Land, marries your sister, and dies of fever within months. Medieval marriage logistics are not, on average, particularly successful. But before he dies, William of Montferrat manages to father a son with Sibylla, a boy who is named Baldwin in your honour, and who immediately becomes the official heir to the throne. You now have a nephew who will rule after you. The line is preserved. The succession is theoretically secured. The crisis appears, briefly, resolved. And then, as is the consistent habit of every situation in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it becomes much worse. Sibylla, now a widow, must remarry. The pressure to find her a new husband becomes intense. Various candidates are proposed. Various factions push their preferences. Your mother Agnes, in particular, becomes obsessed with the question of who Sibylla will marry, because whoever marries Sibylla will, in practical terms, become the next ruler of the kingdom alongside the young Baldwin V. And in 1180, the matter resolves itself in a way that absolutely nobody in the native baronage approves of. Sibylla marries Guy of Lusignan. Guy is a French nobleman, a recent arrival, charming in person, well-connected through family politics, ambitious to the point of recklessness, and, by the consensus of nearly every contemporary observer, profoundly unsuited to leadership of any kind, let alone leadership of a kingdom whose survival depends on careful judgment and disciplined patience. The native baronage is horrified. Raymond of Tripoli is horrified. William of Tyre is horrified. The bishops, knights, and barons of the kingdom collectively understand that placing Guy of Lusignan in line for the throne is roughly equivalent to handing a torch to a man who has never previously been allowed near barns. You, the king, are caught in an impossible position. The marriage is technically a fait accompli by the time you can intervene meaningfully. Your mother and her faction have arranged it carefully. The patriarch has blessed it. Reversing it would tear the court apart. Permitting it endangers the entire kingdom. And so you do what kings in untenable positions always do. You accept the situation publicly while quietly looking for ways to limit the damage. The relationship between you and Guy of Lusignan, from this point onward, becomes one of barely concealed mutual antagonism. He resents your authority. You distrust his judgment. He believes you treat him with insufficient respect. You believe he treats the kingdom with insufficient seriousness. Your court meetings become exercises in passive-aggressive courtesy. Guy bows, you incline your head. Guy proposes, you counter. Guy schemes, you watch. It is medieval politics at its most exhausting. Two men who detest each other forced to share a kingdom because medieval inheritance law has placed them in adjacent positions on a chart of succession. Meanwhile, the man who in many ways crystallizes the chaos of your reign emerges fully into prominence. Reynold of Chatillon. Reynold is a French knight who arrived in the East decades earlier, married wealthily, was captured by the Muslims, spent 16 years in a Syrian prison, was ransomed at enormous expense, returned to the Holy Land more bitter than he left, married again, acquired the powerful lordship of Haute-Jourdain, and proceeded to spend the rest of his life conducting himself as though the rules of diplomacy, statecraft, and basic survival did not apply to him. Reynold is everything the kingdom does not need. He is impulsive, he is brutal, he is greedy, he is reckless, he raids Muslim caravans during truces, he attacks pilgrims travelling between cities, he provokes Saladin personally and repeatedly. He attempts, at one point, an expedition to raid the Red Sea, possibly with the intention of attacking Mecca and Medina, which is, even by the wildly aggressive standards of Crusader behaviour, a level of provocation so extreme that Saladin essentially adds Reynold to a personal list of men he intends to kill in person, on sight, no matter how long it takes. You spend an enormous amount of your reign attempting to restrain Reynold, primarily by sending messengers, issuing commands, threatening penalties, and writing furious letters that Reynold either ignores or pretends never to have received. You cannot remove him because he is too powerful. You cannot punish him without triggering civil war. You cannot leverage him diplomatically because the Muslim courts despise him personally. He is a permanent open wound in your foreign policy. He is the medieval equivalent of an unmonitored social media account belonging to a kingdom, posting inflammatory content during a hostage crisis. And around all of this, your body keeps failing. By 1183, when you're 22 years old, the disease has progressed catastrophically. Your hands are now both useless. Your feet are losing sensation. Your face is increasingly disfigured. Your eyes are beginning to fail. The skin around your nose and lips is swelling. Lesions appear in places you cannot easily conceal. You wear gloves continuously. You veil your face during public appearances. You travel in covered litters because riding has become too dangerous. You require attendance for nearly every physical task, and yet you continue to function as king. You hold council. You sign documents using your forearm to brace a stylus against a tablet. You dictate letters to scribes. You receive ambassadors with carefully managed lighting. You speak slowly because the muscles of your face no longer move with full precision, but you speak clearly. You decide. You command. You preside. The kingdom is held together, in many ways, by the sheer force of your refusal to surrender the throne. And then in 1183, things get worse because Saladin invades. He does so with the same enormous force he has been assembling for years. He marches through the borderlands, captures castles, pillages towns, and approaches the heart of the kingdom. The Crusader nobles assemble. Raymond of Tripoli takes command of the main field army by necessity. Guy of Lusignan is appointed regent for the campaign, because as Sibylla's husband he technically holds rank, and because the kingdom is so politically fractured that no other arrangement is possible. You, lying in a litter, your body now too weak for direct military command, watch the campaign unfold from a distance and from inside your own slowly disintegrating skin. Guy of Lusignan, given the supreme command, proceeds to do what Guy of Lusignan always does. He hesitates. He fails to engage. He misreads Saladin's intentions. He squanders opportunities. He allows the army to remain in defensive postures for so long that disease and supply shortages weaken it without a single battle being fought. Saladin, observing this performance with what one suspects is increasing astonishment, eventually withdraws, having achieved much of his strategic objective without significant losses. The campaign is, by any measure, a humiliating failure for the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and Guy's reputation among the nobles collapses entirely. You, watching from your litter, decide that enough is enough. As soon as you are well enough to act, you strip Guy of Lusignan of his regency. You declare your young nephew Baldwin V the official co-king. You arrange that upon your death the succession will pass not to Sibylla and Decay, but to your nephew directly. You construct a careful legal and political architecture designed to keep Guy of Lusignan as far from the actual throne as possible. The court is divided. Sibylla is furious. Agnes is furious. The newcomer faction is furious. The native baronage is delighted. Raymond of Tripoli is delighted. William of Tyre is delighted. You, the disintegrating boy king, have once again imposed order through nothing but force of will. But the political cost is enormous. The kingdom is now openly fractured into pro-Guy and anti-Guy camps. Civil war hovers permanently in the background. Diplomatic energy that should be directed at Saladin is consumed by internal feuding, and meanwhile your body continues to fail. The remainder of your reign becomes a long, slow exercise in legacy management. You arrange for trusted nobles to oversee the regency for your nephew. You strengthen alliances with the Italian maritime states. You correspond carefully with the European monarchs, attempting to extract reinforcements that, in the end, never quite arrive in sufficient numbers. You negotiate truces with Saladin where possible, even though Reynald of Chatillon keeps breaking them in ways that make formal diplomacy practically impossible. You build, in short, a survival architecture for a kingdom you know will outlive you only by a few years if you are extraordinarily lucky. And then, in early 1185, the disease finally takes you. You die in Jerusalem at the age of 24. By the end you are blind. Your hands and feet are useless. Your face is heavily disfigured. You can barely speak. You cannot stand. You cannot eat without assistance. The illness that began as a small patch of numbness in a child's arm has consumed almost every external feature of the man you became. And yet, even at the end, witnesses describe you as composed, dignified, and aware. You die surrounded by priests, advisors, and the few attendants who have served you continuously for years. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre receives your body. The Patriarch of Jerusalem performs the rites. You are buried in the company of the previous kings of Jerusalem in a tomb whose location would later be lost to history, but whose memory the medieval world would never quite forget. Your nephew Baldwin V succeeds you. He is 8 years old. He is fragile, sickly, and almost certainly suffering from undiagnosed health problems of his own. He will reign for less than a year before dying in the summer of 1186. With his death, the careful succession architecture you spent years constructing collapses entirely. Sibylla, your sister, seizes the throne. She crowns Guy of Lusignan as her king beside her. The kingdom now rests in the hands of the man you spent your final years working to keep away from power. And the kingdom, as predicted by absolutely everyone except Guy and his faction, almost immediately collapses. In the summer of 1187, less than 2 years after your death, Guy of Lusignan leads the entire field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem into the dry, waterless hills around a place called the Horns of Hattin. He does so against the advice of Raymond of Tripoli. He does so against the warnings of every experienced commander in the army. He does so because Reynald of Chatillon and the Templar Grand Master push him into it, and because he lacks the spine to refuse them. Saladin, with the entire patience of a man who has been waiting for exactly this moment, surrounds the Crusader army in the heat of summer, cuts off their water supply, sets fire to the dry grass around them, and destroys them in a battle so complete that the entire military strength of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is annihilated in a single day. Guy of Lusignan is captured. Reynald of Chatillon is captured. The true cross, the holiest relic of the kingdom, is captured. The army that protected the Holy Land for nearly 90 years simply ceases to exist. Within weeks, Saladin marches on Jerusalem and captures it almost without a fight. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in its original form ends forever. The Crusader presence in the Holy Land never recovers to its former extent. The Third Crusade, despite the involvement of Richard the Lionheart and other European monarchs, fails to restore the kingdom. The slow disintegration of Christian rule in the East proceeds for another century, until the final Crusader strongholds fall in 1291, and throughout all of it, the historians of the period return again and again to the figure of Baldwin IV, the Leper King, the boy who held the kingdom together with the force of his will alone, the dying child monarch whose competence was so striking that medieval Europe could not stop telling stories about him. They write that under your reign, despite illness, despite betrayal, despite Saladin, despite Reynald, despite Guy of Lusignan, despite the constant feuding of nobles and the constant strain of impossible circumstances, the kingdom survived. They write that under your successor it died. They draw the obvious conclusion, and reading their accounts, 800 years later, in the comfort of climate-controlled rooms with intact nervous systems, It is difficult not to feel something close to awe for the boy on the stone throne who refused, even as his body fell apart, to drop the burden of his crown. The kingdom of Jerusalem was in many ways a doomed political experiment. A small population of European settlers attempting to govern a vast, religiously contested territory at the far end of medieval Europe's logistical reach. It was always going to fall. The question was simply when and how, and with what consequences. Baldwin IV delayed the fall through sheer personal capacity. He bought the kingdom an additional decade. He preserved its political identity through a period when, by any structural analysis, it should have collapsed. He demonstrated, almost as a side effect, that competent leadership can occasionally outweigh catastrophic biology, at least temporarily. And then he died, and the kingdom died shortly afterward, and history closed the chapter. But while you were alive, the kingdom lived. While you were alive, Saladin could not break it. While you were alive, the impossible balance held, and the medieval world, for all its brutality and superstition and political dysfunction, never quite forgot what you accomplished in a body that should have made accomplishment impossible. To live a single day inside your skin would be, for any modern person, a uniquely brutal experience. The heat, the dust, the pain you cannot feel until you realize too late that you have injured yourself, the constant low-grade theatre of pretending to be healthier than you are, the exhausting choreography of public appearances, the political feuds, the military pressure, the diplomatic correspondence in languages you must conduct without modern translation aids, the smell of incense and unwashed bodies, the flies, the food that has been preserved in salt or smoke or oil, the water that may or may not make you sicker than you already are, the advisers who flatter you while plotting against you, the mother who loves you and yet has used your reign for her own ambitions, the sister who loves you and yet has married a man you cannot stand, the knights who serve you and yet would betray you for the right inheritance, the kingdom that depends on you and yet refuses to cooperate with itself, the disease that is slowly and steadily taking away every part of you, and underneath all of it, the constant low pressure of knowing that you will not live to see the end of your own reign, that the work you do today will not benefit you tomorrow, that your inheritance will pass to a sickly child, that your kingdom will likely fall, that history will record you as a tragic figure no matter what you accomplish, and that despite all of this you must continue, because if you stop, even for a single day, the entire structure will collapse around you. You would not last a day as King Baldwin IV. Almost no one would. The astonishing thing is that he did. For 13 years, from his coronation at age 13 to his death at age 24, he carried a burden that no human being should reasonably have been asked to carry, and he carried it with a grace that contemporaries found almost supernatural. He was not, by any modern standard, healthy. He was not, by any modern standard, conventionally happy. He was not, by any modern standard, even capable of the basic physical activities of leadership, and yet he led, quietly, calmly, with a clear-eyed understanding of his own situation that no one around him fully matched. The historians of the period describe his death as a national tragedy. They were not exaggerating. With his death, the last competent ruler of Crusader Jerusalem passed from the stage. Everything that followed was epilogue. So tonight, as the light stayed dim and the world outside your window continues its quiet, ordinary business. Perhaps spare a thought for the boy on the stone throne, the king whose nervous system betrayed him before puberty fully arrived, the teenager who held an entire kingdom together by refusing to set down a burden that was killing him. He did not last forever. No king does. But he lasted longer than anyone had any right to expect, and he did so with a dignity that has echoed across 8 centuries of historical memory. And that, perhaps, is the strangest gift the medieval world ever produced. Not a great conqueror, not a brilliant general, though he was both at times, not a holy saint, though some have tried to canonize him, but a young man, sick, scared, intelligent, and quietly, stubbornly, persistently king, until the end. Before returning to the texture of the day itself, it is worth lingering for a moment on the wider world in which that day unfolded, because Jerusalem in the 1170s and 1180s was not merely a political capital, it was simultaneously one of the strangest, most economically peculiar, and most religiously dense cities in the medieval world. Pilgrims arrived constantly in numbers that fluctuated with the season, the weather, the latest news of warfare, and the latest rumour of plague along the European coasts. They came from England, France, Germany, the Italian peninsula, Scandinavia, Iberia, occasionally from as far afield as Eastern Europe and Russia. They came on foot, on donkey, by boat, in groups, alone, occasionally in vast organised caravans. They came expecting holiness, transcendence, perhaps a small miracle, perhaps the simple satisfaction of touching with their own hands the stones of the holiest sites in their faith. What they encountered in practice was a city of dust, flies, hot, wind, suspicious locals, exhausted clergy, irritated merchants, and a religious infrastructure that had become, of necessity, an enormous and only partially scrupulous tourist industry. Holy relics were everywhere. Pieces of the True Cross multiplied across Europe at a rate that would have required a forest to produce. Bones of saints accumulated in reliquaries whose authenticity ranged from credible to magnificently invented. Vials of holy water, vials of holy oil, vials of holy dust, vials of holy fragments of whatever the local market would accept, were sold to pilgrims in volumes that suggested either supernatural generosity on the part of God, or more probably, supernatural creativity on the part of medieval entrepreneurs. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, who was a major political figure in your court, presided over the most genuinely sacred portion of this trade, the maintenance of the great holy sites themselves, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which housed what was believed to be the tomb of Christ. The church was, by your reign, a partially reconstructed Byzantine and Crusader building, dim, smoke-stained, crowded, perpetually busy, and managed jointly by several Christian denominations, whose mutual hostilities formed a small, ongoing diplomatic crisis of their own. Greek monks argued with Latin priests. Armenian clergy disputed Syriac processions. Georgian pilgrims maintained their own chapel that no one else was permitted to enter. The entire structure operated according to a delicate, perpetually renegotiated system of who lit candles when, who chanted where, and who walked through which door during which festival. As king, you adjudicated occasional disputes among the denominations because the alternative was riots inside the holiest building in Christendom. Outside the Holy Sepulchre, the city stretched in concentric circles of religious importance. The Temple Mount, which Christians called the Templum Domini, housed the Dome of the Rock, originally an Islamic shrine, repurposed during the Crusader period into a Christian church without the demolition of its distinctive Byzantine-inspired architecture. The Templars used the adjacent Al-Aqsa Mosque, also Islamic in origin, as their headquarters, which is the historical reason their order was called the Knights of the Temple in the first place. The geographical concentration of three religions in the same square kilometre produced, day to day, the kind of cultural overlap that made Jerusalem unlike anywhere else on earth. The same streets carried Christian pilgrims, Muslim merchants, Jewish scholars, Eastern Orthodox monks, Italian shipping agents, Armenian metalworkers, Syriac scribes, and the occasional bewildered traveller from places so distant that the locals could not place his accent. The economy of the kingdom rested partly on agriculture, partly on trade, partly on the steady extraction of money from pilgrims. The coastal cities of Acre, Tyre, Jaffa, and Beirut handled most of the trade with Europe, dominated by Italian merchants from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, who maintained their own quarters within those cities and conducted their business with a level of legal independence that often frustrated your administration. The Italian quarters had their own laws, their own consuls, their own gallows, their own dispute resolution procedures. They paid taxes negotiated through formal treaties and resisted any attempt to tax them further. They were, in effect, autonomous commercial republics nested inside your kingdom, and you tolerated them because their shipping kept the kingdom connected to Europe, which kept the pilgrims arriving, which kept the donations flowing, which kept the treasury solvent. Agriculture was concentrated in the more fertile regions to the north and along the coastal plain. Sugarcane, an exotic and profitable crop, was cultivated in several areas under Templar and Hospitaller management. Olive groves stretched along terraced hillsides. Vineyards produced wines that, in some years, achieved a quality the chroniclers found worth mentioning. Wheat was grown wherever the land permitted, in quantities never quite sufficient to fully feed the kingdom, which meant that grain imports remained a strategic vulnerability throughout your reign. A bad harvest in Egypt, or a bad shipping season from the Italian peninsula, could push the kingdom into food prices that threatened civil unrest within months. Your administrators monitored grain markets with the kind of attention modern central bankers reserve for currency markets. Slavery existed in the kingdom, as it existed across the medieval Mediterranean, and the slave trade was one of the more sordid aspects of the regional economy. Captured Muslim prisoners from raids and battles became slaves. Captured Christians taken by Muslim raiders likewise became slaves on the other side. Ransoms were negotiated constantly. A vast quiet industry of intermediaries, often Jewish merchants or Eastern Christian middlemen, specialized in negotiating ransoms across the religious lines, which they did with a professional efficiency that often surpassed the diplomatic capabilities of the actual rulers involved. You authorized, signed off on, and occasionally personally negotiated ransoms throughout your reign, and the moral discomfort of the institution would have to wait several centuries before the medieval mind was ready to question it systematically. Military technology in the kingdom centered on the great Crusader castles, the chain mail of the heavy cavalry, and the disciplined infantry of the Italian and local levies. The castles were, by 12th century standards, sophisticated. Concentric walls, inner keeps, cisterns capable of sustaining garrisons through long sieges, carefully positioned arrow slits and machicolations, drawbridges and barbicans. Many of them still stand today, 8 centuries later, as ruins that modern visitors photograph from drones. Belvoir, Crac des Chevaliers, Kerak, Saun, Margat, Etlit. These were the strongholds upon which the strategic defence of the kingdom rested. Their construction had absorbed the wealth of 2 generations of Crusader rulers. Their garrisons consumed a steady portion of the kingdom's military budget, and their loss, when it eventually came after Hattin, would mark the practical end of the original Crusader enterprise. The heavy cavalry of the Frankish knights was, as Montgisard demonstrated, one of the most powerful military instruments of the medieval world. A knight in full chain mail, mounted on a trained destrier, equipped with lance and sword and shield, supported by infantry and archers, could shatter formations of much larger but less heavily armoured opposing forces. The cost, however, was staggering. Maintaining a single knight at full readiness required an income equivalent to the produce of a small estate. The kingdom could field perhaps 1,200 such knights at maximum mobilization, which meant that every engagement involving heavy losses was strategically catastrophic in a way that even Saladin, with his much larger but less well-equipped armies, could not easily match. The arithmetic of medieval warfare in the Levant always favoured the side that could afford to lose men. That was always the Muslim side, which was ultimately the slow strategic doom hanging over the entire Crusader enterprise. Intelligence networks operated throughout the kingdom and across the borders, conducted by a combination of formal ambassadors, informal traders, Eastern Christian middlemen, paid informants, and the occasional Muslim defector who switched sides for reasons that were rarely as religious as they claimed. Information flowed across the lines constantly. Saladin's court received reports from Jerusalem. Your court received reports from Damascus and Cairo. The Templars maintained their own intelligence channels. The Hospitallers maintained theirs. The Patriarch maintained his. The Italian merchants maintained theirs, primarily for commercial purposes but with political ramifications. The entire region operated in effect as a vast, slowly turning informational ecosystem in which the major players knew, with surprising accuracy, what their counterparts were doing within a matter of days or weeks. Strategic surprise was rare. Strategic patience was the more important quality. Your physicians, mentioned often in the chronicles but rarely described in detail, were drawn from several traditions. The kingdom employed Christian physicians trained in the medical traditions of the Western Latin world, which by your reign had absorbed considerable knowledge from Greek and Arabic sources, but remained limited by the practical absence of an accurate understanding of disease causation. The kingdom also employed Eastern physicians, including Christian Arabs and occasionally Jewish doctors, who were generally considered more competent because their medical traditions had preserved more of the ancient Greek and Persian medical knowledge and integrated more recent Islamic advances. Your personal physicians almost certainly included men trained in both traditions. They could not cure your leprosy. No one could. But they could manage symptoms, dress lesions, prescribe diets that minimized digestive distress, and perform the careful daily maintenance of a body that was losing function. Their work, while medically limited, was practically essential, and the discretion with which they performed it earned them positions in your inner court that some of the great nobles would have envied. The pharmacopoeia of the period included a wide range of substances, some of genuine therapeutic value, many of placebo strength only, a few outright dangerous. Honey was used for wound dressings, where its actual antimicrobial properties were rediscovered by modern medicine centuries later. Various herbs were used for digestive complaints, some effectively. Opium and its derivatives were available for severe pain, though leprosy, by paradoxically removing sensation, often did not produce the kind of pain that opium could meaningfully address. Mercury-based preparations were sometimes applied to skin conditions, with results modern physicians would describe as enthusiastically counterproductive. Bleeding was occasionally recommended, though the more sensible practitioners tended to spare you most of it, recognizing that a body losing strength steadily did not need its blood volume reduced as well. Religious rituals accompanied medical treatment, because the two were not, in the medieval mind, separable activities. Mass was offered for your health. Prayers were arranged at multiple shrines. Pilgrimages were undertaken on your behalf to distant sites, where saints were reputed to perform miracles. Reliquaries were brought to your chambers and touched gently against your forearms. None of it cured you. Some of it perhaps comforted you. The line between medicine and faith was, in the 12th century, deliberately unclear, and both physicians and priests understood that their work overlapped more than either profession would have publicly admitted. Let us return now to the texture of the day itself, because the long sweep of history can sometimes obscure the smaller, more intimate truths of what it actually meant to occupy the throne of Jerusalem in a body like yours. Picture the morning. The first sound you hear, before anything else, is the distant call to prayer drifting in from the Muslim quarters of the city. Because medieval Jerusalem, despite being technically Christian, is religiously layered in ways that modern maps do not capture. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Eastern Orthodox communities, Armenian communities, Syriac Christians, pilgrim communities of half a dozen European origins, all share the same compressed urban space, all worship within walking distance of one another, all observe their own calendars and their own languages and their own dietary laws, and all do so in a city the size of a modern suburban neighbourhood. The sound of the morning accordingly is layered. Church bells, calls to prayer, the slow shuffle of pilgrims moving toward the holy sites before the heat becomes unbearable, the clatter of merchants opening shutters, the braying of donkeys, the slap of leather sandals on dusty stone, and then, closer to your own chamber, the soft, polite scuffling of servants beginning the elaborate process of getting their king ready for the day. They enter quietly. They speak softly, the way one speaks around an invalid, even though everyone in the chamber pretends not to notice that this is an invalid's room. The chief attendant, a man who has served you for years, checks your linens, your bandages, your gloves. The servants prepare warm water in silver basins. They bring oils and ointments prescribed by your physicians, all of which carry the medieval medical assumption that something fragrant must surely have therapeutic value. You are bathed gently. Your skin, which has lost almost all sensation in much of your body, must be inspected visually for new lesions, infections, or injuries that you cannot feel. The attendants do this without comment. They have been trained to maintain a particular neutrality of expression while inspecting the body of their king. They are skilled at this. They have had years of practice. They find occasionally a small wound that you did not notice, perhaps from leaning on a table edge, perhaps from a stone in your bedding, perhaps from sleeping with your weight pressed too long against a hard surface. They clean it. They dress it. They report it quietly to the physicians who will visit later. You sit through this without complaint as you sit through everything. Then comes dressing. The undertunic, the overtunic, the hose, the belt, the carefully chosen gloves, the veil or partial face covering depending on the day's expected public exposures. Your robes are designed to disguise both the deformities of your hands and the swelling of your face. They are loose where looseness is needed. They are tight where structure is required. They are layered to manage the heat. They are heavy because medieval royal garments are always heavy, and you must wear them anyway, because the alternative is to allow the kingdom to forget that its monarch is a king and not a patient. Breakfast is brought. It is by modern standards peculiar. Bread, sometimes flatbread, sometimes the small dense loaves. The palace kitchens produce in vast quantities. Olive oil, often spiced, cheese, soft and tangy, fruit when available, which is most of the year because Jerusalem's climate is generous in this regard, figs, dates, melon, pomegranate when in season, wine, watered down to medieval breakfast strength, because pure water in a medieval city is not always trustworthy, and wine, even diluted, is safer for daily consumption. Sometimes a small bowl of stewed grains, sometimes a piece of preserved meat. The servings are modest because your appetite is modest. The disease has dulled many of your senses, including taste, which has become muted and inconsistent in ways your physicians cannot quite explain. You eat slowly. You drink slowly. You let an attendant tear the bread for you because your hands no longer perform that task reliably, and then the day begins in earnest. You are carried, on most days now, in a curtained litter from your private chambers to your audience hall. The litter is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of necessity. Walking long distances has become unsafe because your feet, which no longer feel pain, can be injured easily on uneven stones, and even small injuries can develop into life-threatening infections. The bearers are silent. They are chosen for their discretion as much as their strength. They have orders not to speak unless addressed. The hallways through which they carry you are lit by oil lamps, because the palace, though magnificent, was built before anyone thought to design windows large enough to flood interior corridors with light. You catch glimpses, through gaps in the curtain, of priests gliding past, of servants kneeling momentarily, of guards saluting silently as the king's litter passes. The audience hall, when you arrive, is already crowded. Nobles, knights, petitioners, ambassadors, clerks, scribes, a handful of priests, a pair of physicians stationed discreetly along the side wall in case they are required. Your throne sits on a low-raised platform. The cushions have been adjusted by attendants who arrived hours earlier to accommodate your body's current preferred angle of repose. You are settled onto the throne with the soft, efficient choreography that you and your attendants have refined over the years. The crown is placed. The robes are arranged. The veil, if used, is positioned. Court begins. The day proceeds through the medieval rituals of governance, which are essentially long sequences of formal disputes, formal requests, formal complaints, formal flatteries, and formal information sharing. A baron from the Galilee complains about a neighbour. Church official requests an exemption from a tax. A merchant guild from Acre presents grievances about port fees. A knight requests the king's blessing for a marriage. A foreign ambassador delivers a sealed letter from a distant monarch. A bishop presents a saint's relic newly arrived from Constantinople. A military commander reports on the readiness of a frontier garrison. A spy, dressed unobtrusively as a clerk, slips a folded note into the hand of a senior advisor for later interpretation. You listen to all of it. You ask questions. You make decisions. You delegate. You weigh. You consult Raymond of Tripoli when he is present, William of Tyre when he is consulted, the seneschal when administrative matters are involved, the constable when military matters dominate. The kingdom in all its enormity passes. Through your throne room, one petition at a time, Saladin's spies almost certainly hear about every decision you make within days, because medieval intelligence networks are surprisingly efficient when the territory in question is small and the political stakes are high. Saladin reads about your reign in real time, as much as 12th century communications allow. He receives reports of your judgments, your military arrangements, your diplomatic correspondence. He builds, year by year, a careful psychological portrait of his most peculiar opponent. By the middle of your reign, Saladin almost certainly understands you better than most of your own courtiers do. Lunch arrives midday, served in a smaller side chamber where you can rest more private. The meal is fuller than breakfast. Roasted meats, stewed vegetables, bread, wine, sometimes a delicacy specifically prepared for you by a kitchen that has, over the years, learned the foods you can still manage comfortably given the changes in your mouth, throat, and digestive system. The disease has affected your eating in ways that the palace kitchens have adapted around. Foods that require vigorous chewing become difficult. Foods that are too acidic irritate the lesions inside your mouth. Foods that are too rich exhaust your weakened digestion. Foods that are too plain bore you, which, given the modest pleasures available to a sick king, is something the kitchen takes seriously. They find compromises, soft meat stewed for hours, custards, spiced rice, bread soaked in broth. They prepare your meals with the degree of careful intelligence that the rest of the court could learn from. After lunch, in summer, the kingdom takes a brief rest. The heat at midday is, by any reasonable measure, savage. Even healthy people retreat indoors during the hottest hours. Servants close shutters. Knights remove their armour. Priests pause their offices. The whole palace, and indeed the whole city, enters a quiet, drowsy lull. You sleep when you can. The disease has made sleep difficult. Pain in joints that do not feel pain is a paradox your nervous system manages through strange phantom sensations. Heat trapped under your robes troubles you. Your face itches in ways your hands can no longer scratch. Attendants sit nearby and shift your position carefully every so often, like nurses tending a patient who cannot adjust himself. You rest, you doze, you think, you pray, you compose sometimes the careful internal speeches you will deliver to nobles or ambassadors later in the day. You compose sometimes the letters you will dictate to scribes. You compose sometimes the slow internal monologues of a young man who has had years to think about his own death, and has by this point made his peace with most of it, though peace is a flexible word when describing a 20-year-old preparing to die. When the heat eases, court resumes in a different form, smaller, more private. The most sensitive matters are handled now. Spies report, advisors confer. Military commanders bring detailed maps to a low table where they can be inspected without the wider court hearing every word. Decisions are made about which castles to reinforce, which mercenaries to hire, which Muslim emirs to bribe, which European princes to flatter for additional aid. The careful chess of medieval foreign policy plays out in a chamber so quiet that you can hear the oil lamps hiss. Reynald of Chatillon comes up regularly in these conversations as a problem requiring constant management. What has Reynald done now? What can be done about him? Can he be restrained, contained, redirected, neutralized, embarrassed, ignored? The answers are always unsatisfying. Reynald is, by this stage of his career, a force that the kingdom cannot fully control, and your advisors discuss him with the kind of weary fatalism usually reserved for natural disasters. Guy of Lusignan comes up too. What is Guy demanding now? What has Guy mismanaged now? What has Guy promised someone that he cannot deliver? The answers are equally unsatisfying. Your sister Sibylla protects him fiercely, and any move against him risks alienating her, which risks complications for the succession, which complicates everything. The careful architecture of medieval inheritance is, at this point, deeply tangled around the question of how to govern a kingdom whose next ruler must, by political reality, be someone neither competent nor trusted. Evening comes. The day's formal. Business concludes. The Patriarch of Jerusalem visits sometimes for prayers. Mass is offered in the palace chapel. You attend when you can. You sit through the rituals in your veil and gloves, your body propped carefully on the cushions of your private prie-dieu, your eyes closing in moments of deep contemplation that your priests interpret generously as evidence of saintliness. Some chroniclers will later argue that you should be canonized. They will not succeed. But it is not for lack of material. Dinner is small. You eat alone, or with one or two of your closest advisors. Conversation is gentle. You speak about books. You speak about distant lands. You speak occasionally about the future of the kingdom. In the careful, indirect way medieval rulers discuss their own approaching deaths. Your advisors learn to take their cues from you, to follow your tone, to neither minimize nor exaggerate the reality of your condition. You appreciate them for this. They are, in their way, the only people in this kingdom who treat you simultaneously as a king and as a young man. Most of the others see only one or the other. Night settles, the palace quiets. The bells of Jerusalem ring the late offices, and across the city the faithful of three religions offer their final prayers of the day. You are carried back to your chamber. Your servants undress you. They apply fresh ointments. They check again for injuries you cannot feel. They dress your wounds. They light a single oil lamp beside your bed. They withdraw silently. You lie alone in the half-darkness. The disease which has consumed so much of your body has not consumed your mind, and your mind, in the quiet moments before sleep, ranges across the kingdom, the politics, the family, the war, the church, the diplomats, the spies, the merchants, the pilgrims, the knights, the saints, the sinners, the future, the past, and the strange suspended present in which you continue, against all reasonable expectation, to be king. You think of Saladin, far away, almost certainly thinking of you. You think of Sibylla, sleeping in her own chambers, married to a man you cannot stand. You think of your young nephew Baldwin IV, whose small, fragile body carries the same disquieting echoes of fragility you remember from your own childhood. You think of William of Tyre, your tutor, your historian, your most loyal friend, who will outlive you and write your story carefully because he loves you. You think of your father, Malric, dead these many years, who never had to watch his kingdom slip toward the abyss the way you have. You think of Jerusalem itself, the city around you, breathing softly in its ancient stones, and you wonder how much longer it will be Christian. You do not know. No one knows. But you suspect in the quiet, honest place inside your mind that the answer is not very much longer. You close your eyes. You sleep. The kingdom waits for you to wake. And in the morning, despite everything, you do. To live this day over and over, year after year, with a body that loses one more piece each month, while managing nobles who treat your illness as a political opportunity, while opposing a brilliant enemy who treats your continued existence as a temporary obstacle, while maintaining the dignity of a crown that no one would blame you for setting down, would shatter almost any modern person within a week. To do it for 13 years, until your body could no longer carry on, is a kind of moral and political endurance that medieval Europe would commemorate for centuries afterward in poems, sermons, chronicles, and the careful disbelieving accounts of men who had watched you do it firsthand. You did not save Jerusalem. The kingdom died shortly after you did, and history did not grant you the satisfaction of seeing your work outlast you in any straightforward way. But while you ruled, you held the kingdom together. You bought it years it should not have had. You preserved its institutions, its diplomacy, its military structure, its tax base, its administrative continuity, long enough that even after Hattin, even after Jerusalem fell, the political memory of the Crusader state survived for another century in the coastal cities that the Muslims did not immediately recapture. That memory, that institutional ghost of the kingdom you ruled, persisted in Acre and Tyre and Tripoli until 1291, and inside that memory your reign loomed as a kind of impossible legend, the Leper King, the boy on the throne, the dying child who somehow ruled. Saladin himself, when he eventually captured Jerusalem in 1187, behaved with a generosity toward the conquered Christians that has been noted by historians ever since, including the careful treatment of Christian holy sites, the relatively peaceful conduct of his troops compared to the brutality of earlier Crusader conquests, the careful negotiation that allowed many Christians to depart safely. Some have wondered, quietly, whether part of this generosity reflected the strange respect Saladin had developed for you over the years of your reign. We cannot know. Medieval sources do not record private feelings in any clean way, but it is not impossible. Sometimes one's enemies shape one's character as much as one's friends do, and Saladin, by his own correspondence, treated you with a respect he extended to almost no other Crusader leader. The kingdom died because Guy of Lusignan walked an army into a trap, and because Reynald of Châtillon kept breaking truces, and because the Crusader states had structural weaknesses no single ruler could overcome. But while you lived, you held it together, and after you died, it fell. The two facts are not unrelated, and contemporaries knew it. William of Tyre, your tutor, dies a few years before you do, but other chroniclers carry on his work, and their accounts of your reign are unanimous in their praise. You're described as one of the great tragedies of medieval Europe, the king who deserved a healthy body and was given a disintegrating one. The boy who would have ruled with distinction for decades had biology not betrayed him. The prince whose dignity exceeded the limitations of his condition in ways that bordered on the miraculous. Some chroniclers, particularly in the centuries afterward, attempt to portray you as a saint. Others portray you as a martyr. Others, more soberly, describe you simply as the most competent king the Crusader states ever produced, who happened, by terrible coincidence, to be also their most physically afflicted ruler. Modern historians have, on the whole, agreed with the sober assessments. You were not a saint. You were not perfect. You made mistakes. You were occasionally manipulated by your mother. You occasionally trusted advisors you should not have trusted. You allowed Reynald of Châtillon more freedom than was wise. You permitted the marriage of Sibylla to Guy of Lusignan before you fully understood Guy's incapacity. You were, in short, a young man learning to rule under circumstances that would have destroyed older and healthier men. But within the limits of your situation, you performed with a competence that earned the respect of contemporary observers across religious and political lines. Your enemies admired you, your allies trusted you, your subjects, even those who never met you, told stories of your courage that travelled across the Mediterranean. You died young, and you died in pain, and you died knowing that your kingdom would likely not survive much longer without you. But you did not die in disgrace. You did not die a failure. You did not die having squandered the throne. You died as a king, in the literal sense and the deepest political sense, and history has not forgotten it. The strangest aspect of your story, perhaps, is how modern it feels. The political dysfunction of your court mirrors the political dysfunction of nearly every era. The factionalism mirrors the factionalism of every period. The personal cost of leadership mirrors the personal cost of leadership in every era. The strange dignity of someone enduring chronic illness, while still functioning at the highest levels of public responsibility, mirrors the experience of many modern leaders and citizens who have lived with serious medical conditions while remaining productive members of society. You feel across 8 centuries like someone who could be alive today if only the bacteria responsible for leprosy and the medicine capable of treating it had occupied the same century. You were born too early to be cured. You were born too early to be properly understood. You were born too early for any of the modern comforts that might have softened your suffering. But within your time, you did everything possible with the body and circumstances you were given, and you did it with a grace that modern people, comfortable in their air-conditioned rooms, can scarcely imagine. To live a single day as King Baldwin IV would, for most modern people, be unendurable. The physical pain, the heat, the constant veiling, the awareness of one's slow disintegration, the political pressure, the diplomatic complexity, the spiritual weight of ruling a kingdom whose every stone is contested by 3 religions, the slow loss of sensation in every limb, the careful management of attendants who must touch you without flinching, the meals carefully designed around the parts of your mouth that still function, the official appearances during which the entire court silently watches for any sign that today might be the day the king finally falters, the constant low pressure of knowing that absolutely everything depends on you, and absolutely nothing of it will survive you for long. It would break almost anyone. The astonishing thing is that he did not break. For 13 years he carried his crown. For 13 years he attended his court. For 13 years he managed his nobles, his neighbours, his enemies, his church, his family, his body, his pain, his approaching death, his impossible inheritance. For 13 years he was king of a kingdom that should have collapsed without him, and after he died, it did. So tonight, as the lights stay low and the world outside is quiet, perhaps spare a final thought for the boy on the stone throne, the king whose nerves abandoned him before his courage ever did, the teenager who held an entire kingdom together with the patient stubbornness of a young mind that refused to surrender even when the body around it failed him in every conceivable way. He did not last forever. He did not need to. He lasted longer than anyone had any right to expect, and in doing so, he became one of the strangest and most affecting figures of the entire medieval world. The Leper King, the boy on the throne, the dying child who ruled. Sleep well wherever you are, and remember as your eyes close that somewhere across the long quiet centuries a young king in a stone palace once held a kingdom together for as long as his body allowed, and then, gently, when it was time, set it down. The strangest part of his story, perhaps, is not the disease, or the wars, or the betrayals, or the politics, or the heat, or the sand, or the slow disappearance of his hands. The strangest part is how, even now, 800 years later, when you read about him, you find yourself rooting for him as though he might somehow win, as though history might rewrite itself on his behalf, as though the kingdom of Jerusalem might endure simply because he wanted it to. It will not. It did not. But for 13 years it did. And inside those 13 years lived a young man who did everything possible with an impossible hand, and who did it with a quiet integrity that has outlived him by centuries. You would not last a day as Baldwin IV. Almost no one would. He did. He lasted, and lasted, and lasted, and only stopped lasting when his body could not hold him any longer. And then the lights went out, and the kingdom followed shortly afterward, and history moved on, the way it always does, into the next chapter. But the story remains, quiet, strange, affecting. The Leper King, the boy on the throne, the dying child who ruled. Sleep gently, wherever you are, whatever time it is. The night is long, the world is wide, and somewhere, across the long quiet centuries, a young king is being remembered again for one more night, by listeners scattered across a planet he never knew existed, for reasons he never lived long enough to fully understand. It is strange, perhaps, that his story has survived at all. Most medieval rulers fade into the background of their dynasties, remembered only by specialist historians and the occasional dedicated reader. Most reigns blur together into the long indistinguishable march of names and dates that fills the heavier sections of history textbooks. But somehow Baldwin IV escapes that fate. Something about him refuses to fade. Perhaps it is the disease, which lends a tragic vividness to even the most modest details of his life. Perhaps it's the youth, which makes every decision he made feel more weighted because he had so little time in which to make it. Perhaps it is the impossible odds, which transform every minor achievement into a small, inexplicable miracle. Perhaps it is the dignity, which medieval chroniclers and modern historians alike have found impossible to describe without reaching for words that feel too large and too plain at the same time. Or perhaps it is simply that, across the great distances of time and culture, certain human beings emerge from history with a clarity that resists the natural erosion of memory. They become symbols, they become legends, they become, eventually, the kind of figure one tells stories about on quiet evenings, while the wind moves softly through curtains and the lights stay low and the listener drifts gently towards sleep. Baldwin IV is one of those figures. He was, in life, a young man with a body that betrayed him and a kingdom that depended on him. He has become, in memory, something larger and more durable than the political circumstances of his actual reign. The kingdom he served is gone. The throne he sat upon is gone. The palaces are ruins. The chronicles survive only in libraries. The languages of his court are studied now mostly by specialists. The religion that animated him persists in altered forms across the modern world, but its medieval intensity has softened into something gentler and more reflective. What remains in the end is the story. The boy in the stone chamber, learning that he cannot feel pain. The teenager in the church, receiving a crown his body cannot carry. The young man on the horse, charging at Montgisard against impossible numbers, leading knights who would die for him because they understood, at some level beneath conscious thought, that they were watching one of the rarer kinds of courage. The dying king in the litter, holding counsel, signing documents with his weakening left hand, preserving by sheer force of personality a kingdom that should have collapsed under any reasonable analysis. The patient, almost saintly endurance of an entire decade spent watching his own body disappear, while continuing to function as a head of state. The strange respect of his greatest enemy, the quiet grief of his tutor, the hopeful gratitude of his subjects who knew, even at the time, that they were unlikely to ever again be ruled so well by someone so visibly broken. He died young. He died in pain. He died knowing that his work would probably not survive him. But he ruled. For 13 years he ruled. And while he ruled, the kingdom lived. That is the simplest summary anyone can offer of his reign. And it is also the truest. He kept it alive. No one else could have. After he was gone, no one did. So tonight, as the lights stay low and the world outside is quiet, sleep gently and carry the story with you into whatever dreams find you. The Leper King, the boy on the throne, the dying child who ruled. He would not have understood the world you live in. He would not have recognized your room, your bed, your language, your devices, your concerns. But he would have understood, perhaps, the small, steady kindness of someone listening 8 centuries later to a story about a young man who tried very hard to do the right thing under impossible circumstances and who, against all reasonable expectations, mostly succeeded. Good night.